I hope you can join us on this very exciting, special mission. Hello and welcome to day 12 of the International Dance Festival. I know it's been so many days and it just feels like it's flown by, and we have another week or so to go, and we have a yummy, yummy evening coming up of performances. So stay tuned for that. We will tell you more about it, and I hope you're taking every chance to lap up the contests and challenges because we have amazing giveaways for you. We have Kolina Shakti's drill and challenge. We have Shahzad. We have Dipti Shetty's. So there's a lot of amazing stuff happening. And also we have these mini questions for you all in the group, which are fun stuff to play with. And tell us more about you. Send your voting into migrant workers. And even if you're not from India, it's basically about supporting a part of humanity which is being lost and devastated with the pandemic. And we can do our best to support them. And it is really down to karma, and I believe it always comes back. So it's really giving ourselves at the end of the day. And yeah, it always feels good to be kind and nice to people, and we totally encourage you to also share the campaign. So it's very easy to share the campaign. When you go to a campaign, you have a share button on top which has a Facebook icon on it. So you can always tell your friends when you've donated to tell your friends about it. It really goes a long way. In fact, one of our teachers adopted that, and she raised a fair amount just with just that share button. So it does magic, and we really encourage you to go hit that share button and let people know about this amazing festival, because it's not really only for belly dancers, as we know. We're talking about artists in general, and we're also talking about non-dancers. We just had a session on technology and how to go online, and that could just well be used by anybody, including your mom who wants to hold some cooking classes. So yeah, so it's meant for everybody. Well, about our next guest teacher, she's very special. She's based in India. Her name is Shruti Narayan, and Shruti Narayan is an award-winning Oriental vintage Andalusian belly dance artist. She's the founder and director of the Samai Oriental Dance Company. They're also collaborating with us, by the way. So, woohoo! They're giving us some free gifts, which Shruti will tell you more about. So that's been very, very generous of her. And Shruti has been studying and performing teaching since 10 years. And in fact, she was a part of the previous Bewitches festival where she was a performer and a participant. And very quickly, she's grown to a point where a lot of people absolutely love the kind of work she's been doing. And we thought it would be so cool to have her teach at our festival. So here she is, right? And so she's the only certified Muashayat style practitioner in India, and she's also done a journey through Egypt with the Sahara Saida's course, which is very intense. She's done level 1, 2, 3 of that, which is amazing. And she's also done the foundation 1 and 2 of Drumsy School of Dance certification. So all I can say is that Shruti goes beyond just the technique of belly dance. She's got a very inquisitive, curious mind. She loves to get her hands dirty and dig deep and kind of get information. And she does that through several ways. So she does a lot of reading up. She does a lot of connecting with other dancers who are specialists in this field. And she also does a hell lot of observation. She spends hours looking through golden era clips and really trying to discern. And so she's not a person who only comes and tables what has been given to her, but she's really thought, reflected on the material, and she's really giving you a lot of powerful insights that she's reflected on. And I think that's what she also encourages people to do is, to people who are interested in knowing more about the golden era and vintage style belly dance, to really go deep into and come with a curious mind, with an open mind. And Shruti is absolutely the right person to guide you on it. So, well, today's topic is about that. And in fact, Shruti is also curated 4 dance productions which have traced the evolution of belly dance and also the golden era in the Egyptian cinema. So, she's got a lot of experience and backdrop, and she's absolutely the right person to throw light on today's topic. So she'll tell you more about it. And so, yeah, over to you, Shruti.
Hi, Lena. Thank you so much for having me. for the Bewitches Online Festival. I can't tell you what an amazing job you have been doing, just bringing all of these artists together, and not just that, it's such a wonderful cause, right? I mean, we're living in such difficult times, and we're speaking from a place of privilege. We have a roof above our heads, we have food, we have great internet connection, great access to teachers. So, and it's difficult to imagine even what people who aren't so privileged might be facing. And just that thought you had about bringing artists together for something bigger, for something better, I think that speaks volumes about you and what you do. And I just really like to thank you for that, for being so generous with your thinking and with what you're doing right now with the Witches. I'm hoping all of you who've tuned in today and for the 12 days that you guys have been attending all of these amazing workshops, I really hope that you've been contributing generously, because this is a one-of-a-kind festival. You usually see a lot of festivals with really amazing teachers and lots of, fancy stage setups, choreographies, technique, workshops, all of that. But this is really one of a kind, because we're going beyond all that and getting into wellness and, just panel discussions and talks on history and technique. I think it's holistic. The learning here is holistic, and there's so much that we are giving. I mean, you have the opportunity to give. And Lena has been able to do all of that single-handedly. So thank you so much for having me one more time. And I'm just really honored to be a part of something this big and, share my insights with you guys, my insights and interests. And today is all about that for me, because I'm going to be talking a little bit about my specific area of interest when it comes to historical reconstruction, and that goes beyond what we understand as theatrical belly dance or Raqs Sharqi. So I'm looking at this from a perspective of how things were before the theatrical belly dance developed. And I'm looking at a period that's before the 1900s. So I'm technically looking at the 19th century and the turn of the 20th century. So today our focus is primarily going to be on the early performers of Egypt in the 19th and 20th century. And we're looking at the Awalem and Ghawazee performers in particular. And just a little bit more about me. Lena's done a fantastic job of introducing me already, but I'm just going to throw a little more light on why I got into research, because not a lot of people find this a very lucrative space to be in, because you're continuously digging, but the receiving end of it is very, very minuscule. Like, you need to wait it out. You need to spend a lot of years researching, digging, going to people, asking people, spending some time in the area of your interest, and just really developing things from there. I've been a history major student in school, so history has always been my subject of interest. And I think my love for research just began when I was studying Bharatnatyam. I've been a student of Bharatnatyam for about 14 years, and I really just loved studying the culture and the other aspects that go around creating the dance form and making the dance form what it is. And I've come to realize that belly dance is just the same. Isn't every dance the same? Because every art form that you see or you've been associated with is related or linked to a particular culture. And that's what this is about. I want to give you a little bit of insight about, the socio-political aspects and the cultural aspects and the historical aspects of the dance, so that someday when you're taking it forward, or if you're already a professional dancer or if you're a hobby dancer, it's just going to add a little more value and meaning to what you guys are doing. You might just look back at one or two of these moments from today's presentation, something that you might think was valuable, and you might be able to apply it in your own work. So that's how my interest in history generally began. And my research journey actually started off when I had done an arts management course in Chennai in 2014. And right after that, I actually completed a course on Egyptology with Manchester University, and then went ahead and then sort of narrowed down my research into Middle Eastern studies and dance, and I've taken it forward with one of the most important people at UCLA. His name is Dr. Narayanan, and he's been helping me with a lot of, access to material and his archive. And that's how I think I've been able to collate a lot of information from different aspects related to this dance form. So that's exactly what I've been doing, and that's a little bit in a nutshell. So I'm going to start right away, and I have a little bit more to say, but I'm going to tell you what I want to say at the end of this presentation. I've created a presentation for you just to keep things a little interesting. And this is a lecture demo. So you might just see me break into a dance at some point. Please don't find that weird. I just want to show you what things might have been like, and maybe certain body postures, or where your weight should be when you're trying to attempt a Ghawazee movement or an Awalim movement. So that's pretty much what it is. All right, I'm just gonna head straight over to my presentation now. Give me a moment. And all right. I'm not sure if you guys can see this right away. All right, hold on, give me a second. Technology eludes me. This is exactly why I was watching Sahira's meeting, because I thought that was a great workshop, really helped. Can you see it now? All right, sorry, hold on. Just a second, guys. It's open. Okay, fantastic. Just gonna start this. All right, guys. So this is the presentation that I've prepared for you guys today: early 19th and 20th century performers in Egypt. And some of the key concepts that we're going to be covering today is your basic blanket understanding of who the Awalim and the Ghawazee dancers are, and the different terminologies that sort of evolved over time from the 1700s and all the way into the 20th century, and how the meaning changed over time due to socio-political aspects and political upheavals that kept taking place in Egypt. We're also going to be looking at the period before Muhammad Ali's time. Now, for those of you who do know a little bit of Egyptian history, might know who Muhammad Ali is, but if you don't, I will be coming to who he is in just a bit in the presentation. So we're looking at how the Awalim and the Ghawazee dancers basically lived and worked before the 1830s. And now 1830s is an extremely crucial period here, because we're talking about how these dancers were regulated by the government, what sort of taxation they've had to go through, what sort of laws they've had to face. Things were very different before the 1830s, and then went on to change during Muhammad Ali's time. And it really just impacted them in a whole different way with his regime, and how a lot of these dancers actually lost a lot of work and had to be pushed out of urban centers like Alexandria and Cairo to find work elsewhere in smaller towns and the countryside. And then with their return back to Egypt post Muhammad Ali's time, what sort of a shift brought them back to the urban centers, and what that created for entertainment in Egypt. There was a paradigm shift that happened in the world of entertainment in Egypt, and this is somewhere around the turn of the 20th century. And basically what is going on right now, because that's where we are interested, right? That's the area of interest. We want to know what's going on right now with regards to these early performers, because now we look at belly dancers from the point of artists who take their art to stage. What of these guys? What has happened to them? What has happened to their traditions? Has it survived? Are there families that are taking this lineage forward, or has it waned into obscurity? So these are some of the questions we're going to be asking ourselves at the end of this presentation. And I also have some additional resources that I would like to share with all of you in the form of books that you guys can read, music where you can find some music. And we also have a couple of videos that I'd like to show you guys before I actually get down to breaking down a couple of movements for today's session, right? So that's basically what we're going to be covering at large in this presentation. If you guys have any questions, Lena will be handling those questions. I will keep asking in between if there are questions that I've missed out on. I can't see your questions right now, but if I have not found the time to answer to you guys individually, please excuse me. I will definitely get back to you once the session is over on comments on Facebook. Also, if you feel like this presentation or this session might benefit someone, you could go ahead and share it onto your respective pages and get more people to watch it along with you. All right, moving on. The Awalim versus Ghawazee. So Alma is actually a singular term for learned woman, and Awalim is actually the plural for it. And the first use of the term Alma was used in the 1770s by a French writer, Claude Etienne. He was there way before a lot of other writers surfaced. Like, we know a lot of people like Gustave Flaubert, and we know a lot of other travel writers whose works are a lot more, popular. But people like Claude Etienne were actually one of the first few travel writers in Egypt at the time. And this is the first use of the word in the 1770s. And what I really want to tell you guys is a lot of good documentation of dancers actually started in the 18th century. In terms of terminology or in terms of drawings of these performers, we see references that go all the way back to the 1760s and all the way into 1815. So there's quite a bit of usage of these terms like Awalim and Ghawazee that we see constantly being used decade after decade, right, at this point in time. But for the first time, we hear the word Alma in the 1770s by Claude Etienne. And after that, you have people who come in the 1800s, right before Napoleon's conquest. And the word sort of changed a little bit. It turned to Awalim. That's how you pronounce it, Awalim. And the changes in terminology, of course, come with the languages that each individual writer or person spoke at that point in time. But the general idea was that these guys were talking about a specific bracket of female performers in Egypt who seem to have existed from the early 18th century. So from that point, we understand that the Awalim folk were actually professional performers who performed for the middle class households and the elite households. Now, we know this for a fact because of a particular person called Sophia Lane, who happens to be Edward Lane's sister. Now, Sophia Lane comes from a family of really rich historians, and these guys did a lot of work in Egypt at the time. And Sophia Lane was one of the few privileged people who got a chance to watch Awalim performers during her time, and she documented this religiously. And she did mention that the Awalim performers performed at notable households or households that had a lot of money and who could afford them. So we do know for a fact that this comes from a credible source. And from all the other resources that started coming around at this point in time, there have been documents that have stated that the Awalim performers were considered respectable in society because of who they performed for. Most of the time they were performing for extremely elite households or people who were expats and were living in Egypt, or just foreign clientele who could afford to have Awalim performers perform for them. But now we got to think about why these guys were considered respectable, because most of the time they performed for the women in the household, away from the male gaze. And this is a really interesting point, because this is where we see a clear distinction between the Awalim and the Ghawazee performers. The Ghawazee performers, on the other hand, were basically the Awalim for the masses. They performed in the public, for the public eye, for a mixed gender group. So the reason why the Awalim performers were considered respectable was because they danced for women in harems or harems, whatever you would like to call it, away from the male gaze and for special occasions. Now, what are these occasions? Now, you have weddings, you have birthdays, you have circumcisions even. And you also have a traditional event known as the Sabua, which comes from the word Saba, which is basically the Arabic word for 7, which basically stands for a ritual that happens 7 days after a child is born in the house. So these Awalim performers are hired to come and sing or recite poetry or make music. And most of the time, it's away from the male gaze and with the women in a specific setting. And if at all the men wanted to be a part of the ceremony, they'd probably have to be a part of it from another room where they could hear the Awalim people, but they wouldn't be able to see them. And this is why these guys were majorly respected in society. Now, the term learned woman, now we're going to talk about the first point that I mentioned in this particular slide. The reason they're learned women is not because of how literate they were or how far their education took, happened in school. It was mostly because they were well-rounded entertainers in the fine arts. They knew how to sing, they knew how to recite poetry, they could engage in conversation, and a lot of the times they also danced. There are a couple of historians, though, a lot of people's works that I've read and a lot of other lectures that I've heard about Awalem and Ghawazee, where a lot of people are like, no, the Awalim folk only sang, they didn't dance. But then again, there's a lot of proof for it, because we have Sophia Lane, again, who is a credible source, who has written about the Alma dancing at one of the weddings that she attended. So we do know for a fact that the Awalim women performed and danced. Now, coming to Ghawazee. Now, if I'm looking at the term Ghazia, it's the singular term, and I'm looking at Ghawazee as a plural. And literally, the term means invader in Arabic in the feminine form. So the first use of the term Ghazi was used by a German soldier in Egypt called Carsten Neuber. He was in Egypt in the 1760s. And ever since, the term has evolved from Ghazi to Ghawazia to Ghazia, now to Ghawazee. So we have seen a distinct shift in the terminology, but again, we are looking at one blanket term for a section of women who were not as respectable as the Awalim, who are not considered as respectable, but they did perform in public spaces, for carnivals, on the streets, and for the male gaze, and in a mixed gender setting. So we know that these guys, and I'm going to quote one of my teachers, her name is Nisa. She said that these guys were the Awalim of the masses, or she said that she heard somebody say that these guys were the Awalim of the masses. So, like I said, most of them danced at carnivals, they danced at what you would know as a mulid or a mawalid, and they danced in public. Now, for those of you who don't know what a mawalid or a mulid is, it's basically like your All Saints festival. It's one particular day where people celebrate a prophet's birthday, or, it can be religious, it can be secular, and it's not just for Islamic prophets. They had mulids for Coptic Christians as well. And it was at these mulids where there were a lot of entertainers. There were singers, there were musicians, there were dancers, mostly Ghawazee performers. There were also, games for children, lots of stores where you could pick up things, buy things for the household. And of course, there was also some religious stuff happening there. You had things like the zikr happening very frequently in all of these moulids. So it's interesting to note how the change in setting here really formulated the sort of idea that people had about the Awalim and the Ghawazee. So the Awalim were basically restricted to certain areas in the house for certain people, like the women, whereas the Ghazia were pretty much public women. And this sort of publicity led to the downfall of their image in the long term. But either way, the interesting thing to note is that these dancers, both the Awalim and the Ghazia, both came from lower sections of the society, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about in the next slide. So the Awalim came from lower class backgrounds, but had or held higher esteem because they performed mostly for upper class patrons and mostly women. Now, what is interesting to note here is that the only difference that the Ghawazee and the Awalim people had at this point in time was being trained in the finer arts, and of course being managed by a group of, being managed by a particular guild that gave them the sort of support that they needed in order to be contactable by a lot of elite households. The Ghawazee people didn't have that. They just pretty much had to make themselves public on their own. They didn't have an osta to manage them. It was just something that ran in their family, and they had to go from place to place to really, get the sort of work that they did. Okay, so for the Awalim, a very interesting historical reference is with a group of slaves known as the Kaina. Basically, these women, Kaina again is plural, Kian is singular. Basically, these were female entertainers of the Abbasid court. So this is way, way before the Ottoman time, way before the Mamluks. So we're going way back in history. So to actually find a thread of connectivity between the Kaina and the Awalim is really difficult. And that's something that maybe you guys could go back and do a little more reading on and get back to me about it if you do find something interesting. But the references are made. Like there is a certain suggestion that the Awalim tradition stems from what the Kaina did. And these were the guys who were basically slaves in the Abbasid court, and they entertained their guests for specific occasions. Now, there was also another category of upper class female entertainers from outside of Egypt. They were known as the Jankeya. And again, this happened somewhere in the 19th century. But a lot of these people considered the Jankeya as teachers of dance. They were not really entertainers by themselves. So they basically came to Egypt for work. And they were mostly Jewish lineage. Some of them were Turkish and not of Egyptian descent. But we don't have a lot of information on the Jankeya. But if you guys want to go back into reading some of these things, maybe you could try and do a little more research and get back to me on what you find. From what I know, there's very limited information on both the Kaina and the Jankeya. All right. So the Ghawazee come from lower class backgrounds and had lower self-esteem because they performed for the masses and mixed gender crowds. So there's not a lot of difference in terms of where both these groups came from. The difference here was in who they performed for or who their clientele were. And that's your biggest demarcation between the Awalim and the Ghawazee performers. And unlike the Awalim, who were mostly Egyptian, your Ghawazee dancers and singers were of mixed race and mixed ethnicity, and they were different groups that migrated to Egypt over centuries and then settled down in different parts of Egypt. And basically, they were connected by one or two things. And one of these things is they were connected by the fact that they were all social outcasts, and they were not really accepted as Egyptians within the Egyptian context, but they were connected through art and the fact that they were considered social outcasts and they were connected by their work. And it's interesting because some of the more popular Ghawazee groups that we now hear of, or the ones that we've seen, seem to have had some sort of a lineage that goes all the way back to India, somewhere in Rajasthan and places, parts of Gujarat and parts of Punjab. So you have your Dom community that moved out of India and then traveled through the Silk Route. Some of them, stayed on in parts of Spain. Some of them stayed in Turkey. Others migrated to Algeria and Egypt. And that's how you have a lot of differences in ethnicity with these different groups. But it's really interesting. If you do find some time, please do get into the details to find out a little more. So yes, many identify themselves as the Dom people or traveling gypsies, which is, and I don't like to use the word gypsy. It's a little offensive, and I recommend that you don't use the word either, but it's popularly used in a lot of travel writing, and they are considered gypsies because they traveled from one place to another and didn't stay in one place for too long. And every place that they went to, they picked up the culture and it sort of became their own. So that's what we're looking at before the 1830s. And what's interesting to note with both the Awalim and the Ghawazee performers at this point in time was that a lot of comparisons were being made to prostitution at this point in time. And not just comparisons. I think they were all being organized into loose guilds, not the sort of guilds that you would find, not like a European guild or an Ottoman guild. You would find all of these people packed together in one community because it made it easier for the government to extort like taxes from them and, understand what they were doing professionally. And it was easier for them to corner these specific groups of entertainers and get what they wanted from these people. So these guys were actually separated by different guilds and managed by different government guilds. And like I said, they were taxed for their performances. Now, this made it a little difficult for a lot of people to understand, the masses especially, because a lot of them were just clustered together in all of these guilds, like I mentioned earlier, and some of their roles were not very defined, because now you had people like a very low-class Awalim performer might have had an overlap with a Ghawazee, a high-end Ghawazee performer, or a very high-end Ghawazee performer might have found an overlap with an Awalim performer. So that line was a little blurry. So a lot of the Egyptian masses weren't very sure of what sort of a distinction there was between these two groups at this point in time. And I think a classic case, again, I'm going to quote one of the examples that my teacher, Nisa or Heather D. Ward, brought about. She mentioned about this case by an Egyptian writer called Jabarti. This isn't his full name. I'm forgetting his full name. Please go back and find out the full name. So Jabarti was basically of a really high scholarly class. And in 1814, it was the period of Ramzan, and there were all of these troops, these Egyptian troops who were, regaling one another with stories outside the citadel, and they were sitting there, and he was horrified. Jabarti was horrified because he was actually watching this. He forced one of the cafe owners to open a cafe, and they sort of shoved themselves in, and they pulled a couple of dancers along with them. And this was, you got to think about what time this was. This was Ramzan. So no vices, no drinking, no smoking, none of that is generally allowed. But this is what happened. And they pulled dancers along with them. And Jabarti has very clearly written about 3 different types of dancers or 3 different types of performers he saw at this particular cafe. So the first of them was the Ghawazee, and the second he mentioned something about prostitutes, and the third was a new category or a new word that we actually hear in history known as the Raqasin. Now, when you think about Raqasin, for those of you who understand Raqs or you've heard the word of rakasa or rakasin, you will know that you are talking about dancers. Now, we don't know for sure if the rakasin were Awalim performers, but we do know that he clustered all of these women under a blanket term of ill repute. So that's exactly how he wrote about them. And we know that he didn't really understand the differences in the quality of the dancing or the differences between these women. So we do tend to get a sense about what sort of a view the public had about all of these performers. The idea was not always clear. They knew they were performers. They understood that the Ghawazis performed at more public spaces and the Awalim performed at more private spaces, but that's about it. When they were organized into guilds, they were basically just clustered together. So it wasn't very defined. And this sort of created a little bit of a problem for them going forward. And it was because of, being loosely attached to different guilds like this, the Egyptian population started to get a little tired with how Muhammad Ali and Muhammad Ali's government, which was now being set up, was extracting tax revenue from these immoral trades. And this led to an overall ban with, these performers, the Ghawazis and the Awalim performers in Egypt, because Muhammad Ali at the time, he was the Pasha at the time, was under a lot of stress because at the time he did come into power, he brought about sweeping economic changes and taxation was one of them. And he heavily taxed these performers. He taxed the Ghawazis, he taxed the Awalim performers, and people were really just taken aback by how the government could tax an immoral practice such as dancing. And it was that growing public resentment that, eventually led to the overall ban of these performers in urban centers like Cairo and Alexandria. But more on that in the next few slides. The next slide is actually a very interesting one. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about early costuming practices. Now, we know for sure that this woman right here, and this is a very famous picture by Luigi Mayo. This is actually an illustration of Egyptian dance. And we know that this person right here is a Ghawazi and not an Awalim performer. And I can say this with certainty because she's outside her house. And to be outside her house near a harbor like that without modesty clothing was not something that Awalim performers would do. Awalim performers, because they were considered respectable in the society, always dressed up with a little bit of a modesty cloth, either a burqa or a malaya, every time they stepped out. Now, the Ghawazi performers were not that worried about what people thought. They were actually pretty upfront in the way they dressed. Sometimes they dressed gaudily, sometimes they dressed very questionably according to the societies back then. So we do know for a fact that this right here is of a Ghawazi performer. And I need to point this out to you guys before, I move on with the remaining description of what's going on here. Most of the women in Egypt at the time dressed the same way. So the garments that you're seeing right now are not very different from what they might have worn at home. The only difference is if they stepped out, they'd probably cover themselves a lot more and cover their heads just to, stay away from the male gaze or from, the prying eyes of the police. But in this case, we do know because of the open kameez or chemise, we know that this is definitely one of the earlier performers. And in this case, it could be the Ghawazi, right? So now what we're looking at are different aspects of the costuming that we see actually develop. And we see this consistently for the next 2 decades or so, and then it begins to change. So what we have on top is a yelek, and the yelek is basically a long tunic, which is more like, it's more like just one fitted piece with a button or two, and it's like an overcloth. It's not your actual garment. It's something you would wear on top of your chemise, which is your longer tunic on the inside, and that's what you're probably wearing as your first layer on the inside. And the yelek is basically like an overcoat on top of it, and it's nice and fitted. So it traces the silhouette of your body, especially going by what Luigi Mayo here has illustrated for us. And then the pants, the balloon pants that you see at the bottom, were known as the shintian or shintian, whatever you would like to call it. So these pants were very common when you're looking at Ottoman designs or Ottoman costuming. This is very, very reminiscent of that sort of costuming. The pants came from the Ottoman sensibilities and began to change a little more towards the mid 20th century. And we're going to get to that in just a bit. We also see a scarf that she's tied around her hip. So we know right away that to tie a scarf around the hip, if you were just a normal commoner, would not make sense. We know that she's either out for a performance, or she's ready to do a dance or break into a dance. So she's got a scarf, and that seems to have stayed till today. We have scarves that we wear for our classes, and we have scarves that we use or belts that we use when we perform on stage. So that's an aesthetic that's remained for a very long time. And at the top, you can see a square handkerchief that's going around the head, and that's known as the farudea. If you actually watched male performers, and there were male performers like the Ghawazee back then, there were male performers in the 19th and the 20th century, they'd have a more round turban. This is more square, so we know that this is the sort of layout that worked for women. So this is overall what you would see in mid 19th century to towards the turn of the century. So this is one of the most popular costuming back then. And you can also see that most of these women are tattooed. Now, to have tattoos is again something that was considered a fashion that lower classes adopted, and not something that a lot of elite women or elite women would have adorned, right? Okay, moving on. All right, so we're going to talk about Muhammad Ali a little bit. And just before we get on to Muhammad Ali, I just need to ask, are there any questions blowing up, Lena? Okay, I'm assuming there's nothing going on, but in case you guys have questions, please do keep typing, and I will ask Lena in between if there's anything that you guys have specifically.
There are no questions as such, but people are absolutely loving your presentation and the insights that you're sharing with them.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you. I'm really happy. Also, guys, please do let me know what you think. I think it's great to, and if there's something that I've missed out, please do feel free to put it in the comments, because I'm really interested to know if, we're always learning from each other, and there's always something that I might have missed out. And it's just a 1.5-hour workshop, so I'm trying to get as much as I can out to all of you without really compromising on the really important bits of information. Okay, so coming to Muhammad Ali, he was somebody who was known as the founder of modern Egypt. And I say 1800s to 1848 because now this is contested. A lot of people say 1805 to 1848, and a lot of historians have written 1811 to 1848. So we're not really sure about the dates. So it's always safer to go with a bracket period. So I'm saying 1800 to 1848. And he was basically the founder of modern Egypt. And he was an Albanian Ottoman officer, and he emerged as Egypt's ruler and introduced European military reforms and created a powerful army and navy. And that basically freed him from the dependence on his nominal Ottoman overlord, right? So Muhammad Ali, I'm just going to talk a little more about him. Muhammad Ali also attempted to modernize Egypt's economy through reforms in agriculture, infrastructure, education, medicine, and industry. To keep Egypt secure, he allied with powerful rural landlords to control the peasantry, which didn't really work in his favor, but that's what happened. They resisted his efforts to do so, and it remained an entrenched class. And one of the things that Muhammad Ali really brought about when he was a ruler was sweeping economic reforms, like I mentioned earlier. And one of those things was major taxation of Egyptian public. And by the 1930s, and this is the most crucial period for the Awalim and the Ghawazee performers, because by the 1930s, the public started to get so agitated with the fact that, these groups were being taxed. And because of this sort of, a pressure that he had to face, he had to take the call of banning these performers completely in urban centers like Cairo and Egypt. And there was one other reason that I remember distinctly when I had taken one of the other sessions on the Awalim and Ghawazee from another teacher, was the fact that the Awalim and Ghawazee and basically prostitutes were plying their trades with foreigners, and that was considered degrading to a lot of Egyptians. So the fact that they were being taxed for it was something that they took to their ego, and obviously that put a lot of pressure on Muhammad Ali, and he decided in the 1830s, maybe 1834, we're not sure, again with Kathleen Fraser's book Before They Were Belly Dancers, she's debated, she's spoken about that. She said she's not too sure that it happened in 1834, so we're just going to say 1830 to be safe. He banned the public performances of the Awalim and the Ghawazee, as well as prostitutes in Cairo and Alexandria. And now the interesting thing is the people who went against the law would receive 50 lashes. Pretty scary, right? So they'd receive 50 lashes, and repeat offenders would either be deported or they'd be subject to 1 year of hard labor in Cairo or Alexandria. Some were sent to the countryside to live out the rest of their lives with no food and no money. So that really became a tough situation for a lot of these artists. A lot of Awalim performers got away because not a lot of their performances were regulated by the government, but it's mostly the Ghawazees that faced a lot of ostracization from the society. So they actually moved from these places and they settled in the countryside, smaller towns, villages like Luxor, Kena, Aswan. And how did that impact these dancers? So you see a sea change here, because now in the countryside, the circumstances are very, very different. There's a profound impact on these women. Now, the Awalim performers who were also banished to the countryside were now competing with the Ghawazis. So the Ghawazee and the Awalim performers were now pitted against each other in a situation they didn't want to be in, because earlier they had a distinction. They performed, one group performed specifically for the elite, the others performed specifically for outdoor festivals and marketplaces and stuff like that. And now they were all just competing for work in the countryside because they had nowhere else to go and they had nothing else to do. So there was a lot of overlap, right? And they were thrust into a situation where they had to, make their ends meet and, compete pretty nastily with one another. And another thing that happened was that now the performances were mostly at Moulid and for foreigners who traveled to these places for tourism. So they really had to depend for economic stability on Moulids. That didn't really happen as often because, like I said, Moulids happened to celebrate the birthdays of prophets. It was like an All Saints Day, and it's not something that happened on a weekly basis. So there was a lot of disparity with where they were in terms of their work and in terms of the income. or they really had to just wait it out and wait for foreigners to come looking for them. So that was a really sad state of affairs right after the ban. The next thing that I'd like to talk about is, the security concern. Now, you're vulnerable. You're in a place that you've never been in before. You're in a situation you've never been in before, and you're desperate for work. And that makes you vulnerable to different groups of people like pimps, money lenders, even the police in this case. And a lot of people had to resort to prostitution to really just make ends meet. And I think this is where it gets interesting for us in history, because a lot of people, especially in India, a lot of people view belly dance with the idea that it's a very sexual and sensual dance form. And they're not entirely incorrect when you actually think about its history, because we do have occasions like this where people or dancers have had to resort to prostitution to actually survive. But belly dance is not just about that, right? So there are certain links to this, but it's not only this. And that's what I would like to tell the general public who's watching this workshop today. I hope you can finally understand that there's this one point in history where all of this happened, and it was mostly out of, pathetic circumstances and stuff that they had that were thrust upon them. So security risks made them vulnerable, and they had to continue into prostitution to make a living. And in the public eye, this class-related performances started to wane out. So like I said, they weren't just dancing for the elite, or they weren't just dancing for mulids. Now they were dancing to save their lives. And now the distinction got blurry to the point of fading away. So the meaning of the terms Awalim and Ghawazee began to change at this point in time. If you were an Awalim or a Ghawazee during Muhammad Ali's time, and if you were banished, you were basically just a dejected performer, really just scouring for work, and sometimes even having to get into prostitution to survive. So you got to think about how it was for them before the 1830s and how it impacted them now. Right, so this is what I was talking about. So this distinction is definitely fading away and during this period. Some of the notable dancers from this period are Kuchuk Hanem, Aziza of Aswan, and Safiya of Esna. Now, a lot of my students who are probably watching this right now would probably know how much I've been obsessing about Kuchuk Hanem. I even got a chance to play her for one of my productions, and it was really interesting to go through these various accounts and put up a piece that reflected Kuchuk Hanem's life in a very small way. It was just one piece, but yeah. Anyway, so Kuchuk Hanem was basically one of those infamous artists that we have a lot of information about because of people like travel writers like Gustave Flaubert, who actually wrote about his experiences with Kuchuk Hanem in nauseating detail. So basically, he was talking about his sexual encounters with her and everything that she did for him during this time. And he wrote about it, and he wrote mostly about his sexual encounters with her and how she was dressed and how she moved and how she leapt and how her breasts moved. So this is basically what he wrote about. So we do know Kuchuk Hanem from the eyes of Gustave Flaubert. And then we have people like Safiya of Esna, who was again notorious and appeared in a number of accounts. She did begin her journey as an alma, and she was one of the entertainers who was banished, and now she was settled in a place called Esna. And even though she was notorious for her behavior, she was actually pretty respected as an artist, even in Esna, because she seems to have come from a wealthier background. She was a favorite of the elite. Most of the people who went to Safiya of Esna during this period were also elite patrons. So we know that she was wealthy because a lot of these travel writers commented on her grandeur and where she stayed and stuff like that. And then we have, of course, we have Aziza of Aswan, who also in similar circumstances found her way performing for her clientele on boats. And this was in Aswan, so we know this is near a water body. And it's very interesting because she had a very different performance venue in terms of where she was performing. We know of Kuchuk Hanem and Sophia performing in the harems or the harems of where they were staying. But Aziza of Aswan, there are plenty of accounts, and there's one by Kathleen Fraser. There are plenty of accounts where she's been mentioned and people have written about her performing on boats. Right? Apart from dancers, we also have some notable singers of this period. We have Sakna and Almaz, and these guys basically were extremely famous, and we know that Almaz was a protege of Sakna, and even though there's not a lot of information on them, we do know that they were really, really popular and entertained foreign clientele with their singing only. All right. So coming to the next slide, the term Alma continued to be used for female professionals well into the 20th century, but we do know that the Alma were associated with being singers as well. That changed, and a lot of the singers were now professionally being known as Mutraba or Mogania. And that seems to have changed somewhere in the 19th century. And these terms actually, Mutraba and Mogania, became more connected to women and to singers who are a little more esteemed. And like I said, because of the ban that the Awalim and the Ghawazee faced, the Awalim dancers and singers were now considered dancers of lower class and dancers and singers of lower class and low repute. So Mutraba and Mogania actually began replacing the term Awalem or Alma. All right. So, like I said, the Awalim were now being termed as common dancers, as singers who performed for the lower middle classes in Cairo and Alexandria. Ghawazee were now termed as common dancers, as singers working for the Falahin population or the rural folk. So now the distinction sort of changed from who they performed for to where they were performing. So it became more geographic. If you were a performer in an urban center and you were performing for the lower, the middle class, you would be considered Awalim. If you were still in the countryside and your clientele were majorly rural folk, majorly Falahin folk, you would be considered Ghawazee. So the change in the dichotomy started here was between, now was between where they were performing as opposed to for who they were performing. Right. And now, all in all, if you look at it, because of the ban and because of this period that they needed to go through between the 1830s to the 1890s, the Awalim and Ghawazee were considered low-class performers henceforth through the 19th century. So we do know that it's a sad period for them, but things slowly and gradually began to change in terms of the opportunities they started to get, and that's where I'm headed to in the next slide. Right. The taxation of Awalim and Ghawazee performers resumed in the 1860s, and this is post Muhammad Ali's time. We are now looking at a period where these dancers are slowly making a comeback into your urban centers, but the regulation was still very, was in specs. It wasn't as stringent as it was before, but it sort of gave them a little more opportunity than it did earlier when they were social outcasts. So they did start to find a lot more work when they started to come back to the urban centers, but not as much as they did when their ancestors performed or, from the time they were performing in before the 1830s. So with the British occupation in 1882, a lot of foreigners started to come into Egypt. Obviously, you had a lot of armed forces coming in, and they wanted to be entertained. And even though the restrictions, like I said, were a lot less, the idea of having public performances was still frowned upon. So a lot of people were being very careful about where these performers were performing. Were they performing for festivals? Were they performing for certain occasions at home? And that sort of brought about a drastic change in terms of performance setting, because now you had foreign clientele who were being extremely pushy and who wanted a little more entertainment. So now you began to see a slight shift in where these people performed, and you start to see a little more public dance performances happening in one cafe and then another cafe, with a couple of breaks in between. It's not together, like it's not one day after another, but there's one performance happening on a Tuesday, and then there's one performance happening on a Saturday at the same cafe. So you're now beginning to see the art shift out of private performance spaces and very public performance spaces for Ghawazee performers, and go into a somewhat midway place. And now people were performing for performance sake. And it was beginning to change, because earlier, all of these dances stemmed from a social context. You needed to have a birthday or a circumcision to be able to call an Awalem performer. You needed to have an All Saints Day festival in order to be able to see a Ghawazee, or sometimes, if you were lucky, you would see them perform anyway. But now people could actually watch performance for performance sake, and that was slowly beginning to creep in to Egypt at this point in time. And there was this one particular area in Cairo, and I had the great fortune of visiting this place the last year for a journey through Egypt with Sahara. And this place was called the Esbekia Gardens, and then went on to becoming one of the most prominent places in Egypt. For a lot of entertainment halls were set around it. A lot of cafes started to pop up at this point in time. And like I said, now the performance setting was beginning to change. And this was the paradigm shift that sort of changed everything for all of these performers in Egypt.
Shruti?
Yes.
Tariq Sultan has to say something.
Yes.
So he said that the distinction is that the dance is primarily a social dance. Professional performers are doing social dance for paid audiences, whereas ordinary people dance socially for each other. Professionals on hard times are forced to get into prostitution. It's the same as Western ballerinas that had to become escorts or prostitutes to survive economically.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's his comment.
Okay. Yeah, that's actually a very good observation. I'm not sure. I'm sorry. Who did you say this was by? I didn't get the name.
By Tariq Sultan.
Tariq Sultan. Actually, that's a great observation. You are correct, with what you're saying. And I'd like to add to this, actually. And I think I'm going to do that right after this presentation is over. I'm going to get back to your comment and add a little more to what you stated here. So just stay tuned and hold on to that thought for a bit for me. And I will come back and I will address it one more time at the end of this presentation. All right, so we are now looking at the next slide, which is the 19th and 20th century costuming practices. And from the first slide, you see a little bit of a shift in how the costume is presented. Of course, the overall ensemble looks similar, but now you're beginning to see that some of the pieces are worn a little differently. And I'd like to point out a few things. So the smaller picture that you're seeing, the one with the cartoon in the front, is basically what you would have seen in the 19th century. So it's similar to what you saw in the earlier slide, except that you don't really see the shintian, you don't see the pants underneath, right? But you do see a shorter coat on top, something that's shorter than the yelek, and that was known as yantari. And from this point on, you start to see, clothes becoming minimal. Like you start to see how there's a drastic change in how the costuming starts to go from something long into something short. And that's a very interesting change. And I think this actually marks the beginnings of an actual costume, because now you see the antari, and then from there you you look at the sudairi. That's a shorter version of the antari. It's like a vest, and the vest is primarily something that was worn by a lot of 20th century Awalim performers, a lot of Awalem and Ghawazee performers. So that vest became a common focal point for our costuming practices, because we believe that the bedla stems from here. The bra and the skirt, the bra actually stems from this point. Then you have the chemise, which we had in the earlier picture as well. But this time you see that the chemise is not a garment by itself. It's sort of tucked into the skirt. So you see that drastic shift there. And another addition is the ribbon belt. So you see the ribbon belt, which is a commonality in most of your Awalim and your Ghawazee costumes going forward. And this ribbon belt is actually the beginnings of a proper belt addition to a costume from this point. So it's very interesting to see how the costuming practices changed. And of course, you have, through the 20th century, you see that the styling shifts a little bit. So you move out of the Ottoman style and they sort of adopt European fashion. So you tend to see skirts coming in instead of pants. And then you have European shoes, moving from Ottoman shoes to European shoes and stockings. So a lot of these sensibilities start to seep in to the costuming practices in the 19th and the 20th century. Right, so this is what I was talking about earlier as well. Right until the 19th century, the performance contexts were for mostly social gatherings, either weddings, circumcisions, sabuas, mulids, and it would generally be frowned upon to have entertainers unless there was some sort of a social justification for it. And towards the end of the 19th century, entertainers were regulated again at one point, and the opportunities began to wane, which is why they started to take their dancing into more public contexts where a lot of foreigners were looking for performances, and they wanted performances from the Awalem and Ghawazee because there was now an increase in the number of expats in the community, and they were just looking at different ways of being entertained. So we now see a new performance context coming into play in the form of entertainment halls, and this really shifts everything because now the dance is looked as a dance for entertainment purposes. All right. Now, this is the most important point here. I think this is the point where a lot of people and a lot of historians actually would like to consider this the beginnings of Raqs Sharqi. So this is somewhere at the turn of the century, and you're looking at the 1890s to the 1900s. This is the beginnings of Raqs Sharqi because now you're taking the dance out of a social context and now you're putting it out for the sake of entertainment. Right. This was actually a very creative period when you're looking at the beginnings of the 20th century. You're looking at it as a very creative period. Now, dancers are actually transitioning out of their traditional setup. And now we know that the Awalim dancers were managed by an osta or a matron who, gave them performances, trained them, gave them a house, fed them, all of that. And then it now moves into a context where you're managed, by a man or an agency, and, things start to really shift. There's a paradigm shift in the way they're managed, in the way they're managing their art, who they're performing for, how much they're getting paid, and the sort of creativity that they have with their dances at this point in time. And it's here where we first hear the word properly. We hear the word rakisa, which is properly used to describe dancers who perform in entertainment halls. So now the words Awalem and Ghawazee are slowly waning into obscurity. We don't hear too much about it anymore. We're actually just looking at an overall blanket term known as Raqisa to describe a dancer or someone who's practicing her art at the entertainment hall. Today, all dancers are termed as Raqisa, like most of us would be called Raqisa or Fanana, who are obviously also known in another way. And it's actually what it actually means is you're an artist if you're called a Fanana. And this is another word that's dying out in the Egyptian performance setting because we're not thinking about well-rounded art. We're looking at it from the perspective of just dance. So a lot of dancers prefer the term Raqisa. This is something Dina spoke about in one of her interviews. And maybe if I can look for that link, maybe I'll post it after this session is over so that you guys can go ahead and take a look at the interview that Dina gave about the same. The terms Awalim and Ghawazee were still understood within the geographical context. So if you did want to talk about the Awalim or Ghawazee, you would have to look at it from the point of urban versus rural. And if you wanted to see a Ghawazee dancer, you'd probably have to travel to Kenya or Luxor to actually watch them perform. Otherwise, there was a whole shift in the way dancers were now being looked at, because now foreigners wanted to see the sort of art that Raqisa were putting up in the entertainment hall setting and not so much in the social setting. So a lot was changing in terms of how the dance was being presented, how the dance was being choreographed in terms of, stage aesthetics, how your body was, supposed to be in terms of a high center, a low center. All of those things were now being looked at in entirety. And if you were looking for something that was more traditional, you would probably want to go back to, to having a circumcision or a birthday party, to have an awalim, or even a zefa ala rusa, which is a bridal procession going from, the bride's house to her point of, where she's getting married. That's where you would have an awalim performer, mostly in your lower and middle classes now in Egypt. And if you wanted to see the Ghawazee, you'd probably just go to the countryside and watch them. But the Raqisas were now quickly replacing traditional forms of art in Egypt. And like I said in the earlier slides, costuming was becoming more defined. Your European style skirts were now turning into a lot more fitted skirts, and the vest that we saw earlier was now turning into what we know as the bra. So there was now an entire shift in the costuming, going from traditional Awalim Ghawazee costuming into what we know as the bedla. All right, now this is one of my favorite things to talk about, because when you are looking at, performers, especially in the urban setting and the rural setting, there's a dichotomy in terms of what sort of music was being played for them. Of course, we know that urban ensembles or smaller ensembles were known as taqts, the ones that had just instrumentation and no vocalization. Most of these ensembles basically used instrumentation that were considered instruments of high art. So you had not just your regular percussion like your darbuka or your tabla beledi, but you also had instruments like the rik, the qanun, the oud. All of these things were not very common with rural instrumentation. So there was an entire shift in even the music that was now accompanying these dancers for stage. And it was more applicable for entertainment halls that were now slowly popping out in the 10s. So we have this picture here, the one that you can see right now, is from one of the dance historians called Trish St. John. She was kind enough to lend this picture to me. And it's it's also available online. This picture, there are various versions of this available online, it's floating online, so you can find it. But this seems to be one of the clearer ones that I have. And this is of a very popular entertainment hall called El Dorado that emerged much before Badia Masabni's time. So a lot of dancers might know who Badia Masabni is, but she was not the first person to have made Raqs Sharqi what it is. We need to go back to all of this, to the Awalem, the Ghawazee, how their lives changed with Muhammad Ali, and then, you know, the coming up of different cafes chantants around Ezbekia Gardens, and how all of this put together basically gave birth to Raqs Sharqi as a whole. So this image is from the El Dorado. Now, some of the rural instruments that you are more familiar with include the tabla beledi, the duf, the rebaba, sometimes the mizmar, and even the longer instrument, the argul, which is not very common, which was not very commonly used for, you know, urban stages. So this is something that you would have to think about and get deeper into if you were interested in learning a little more about musical accompaniment for early performers in Egypt. Now, this is interesting because this is something I, again, wanted to talk to you about towards the end of the presentation, but I thought, hey, why not? Why not make a slide in between? Because it sort of goes with the flow, and we're talking about notable performers who started to come out with different versions of their art. Of course, they did come out as Awalem or Alma, and when they did go on stage, or when they were presented for films, they were presented very differently in the context of how a foreign crowd would want to see them. So their costuming is definitely one of the aspects that changed completely. The costuming is something that would have changed drastically to suit the needs of the foreign clientele, and not what the Alma or the Ghawazee performers would have originally worn. One of the notable performers of the 20th century was Bamba Kasher, and she is believed to be one of the first people to have appeared in a silent film in the 1920s called Layla. Now, I have no idea where we can find this, because I've searched and I've looked for it. We don't have any sort of documentation, or we don't have clips of this film. So I'm not very sure of where you can look for Layla, but we do know that she did appear in this particular film, and she was one of the first notable Alma to have made an appearance in cinema. Then we have Shafika Al-Qibtiya, who is also known as Shafika the Copt, and she now was somebody who didn't make it into film, but she was one of the names associated, one of the most infamous names associated with the club I was talking to you about in the previous slide, El Dorado. So she was looked at as an inventor of sorts, because people understood her as the person who made the Shamadan or the candelabra dances popular. Now, for those of you who haven't seen a Shamadan, this is what it looks like. It's a fancy, the one that I have is a 9-piece candelabra, and it goes on top of the head, and you sort of balance it and do movement with it, either on the floor. Today, people do it on the floor, and then there's other movement that you do standing. And Shafika is said to have been one of the first few people to have popularized the Shamadan, though there's not a lot of literature that confirms that she was the first person to do it. But there have been a lot of associations with the Shamadan and her, so we'd like to always give her that sort of appreciation and the sort of validation, right? So she was the one who made it popular. And it was also represented in films by another artist called Hind Rustam, who happened to be the Marilyn Monroe of the East. She played the role of Shafika Al-Qobt for one of her performances, and you can find that online on YouTube. And I might just put a link of that at the end of this workshop for you guys to see. It's actually very interesting to see how people have depicted different Awalim movement and styles and just thrown it into the mix for Egyptian cinema. Really interesting if you take a look at it. Another performer of this time was not a dancer, but a singer. Her name was Tawhida, and she performed in a club called Alf Layla wa Layla, which is also known as 1001 Nights in Cairo. And you know what's really cool about her was she actually self-published a book on the songs that she sang at this club. And the variety of songs that she sang at this club were known as the takatik. Now, this is a kind of variety of upbeat, peppy sort of songs, and you can tell with the word takatik that it actually means something fun. And she actually made her own book with all of her songs. And she was said to have been an Alma before and made her big entrance on stage with the Alf Lela Wa Lela Club. Right. So at the turn of the 20th century, and we're almost nearing the end of this presentation, we know for a fact that a lot of Awalim dancers started to live on a street, ironically known as the Muhammad Ali Street. They were banished in the first place because of Muhammad Ali's regime, and they were back onto the Muhammad Ali Street. And though the connection is a lot farther than that, because we do know that even before Muhammad Ali's time, there were a lot of Awalim households that basically lived around the same area that is now Muhammad Ali Street. And basically, all of these people at the turn of the 20th century was still being managed by Osta, or the matron who gave them work, trained them, housed them. And so each Awalim household probably had about 5 to 6 Awalim performers and one Osta who came to them and told them, okay, you know, we have to go here today, or we have this wedding today, we need to perform here today. So basically, they were being managed. And although it was a dying tradition, there was still a lot of Awalim households that still tried to keep that tradition up through the 20th century. And it just started to wane out from the 1940s onwards, which is something that's really sad in my opinion. But in any case, you'd find a line of Awalim houses on the Muhammad Ali Street. So you had all of these apartments, these dilapidated apartments now, with different houses housing all of these Awalim people. And then there were lines of oud makers and lots of shops that sold musical instruments. And basically, it was the nexus of entertainment in Cairo, the Muhammad Ali Street, especially for Awalim performers. And a lot of people were running out of work because, as I said, a lot of the demand for these performers was now going down with what was happening in the Egyptian film industry. And because of that, a lot of these Awalim performers were now making a crossover into films.
Shruti,
now, yes.
Tariq Sultan again has one more comment. He said that
Yes.
Shafiq used a freestanding shaman as versus the cap we use now.
Sorry, your voice is breaking. I can't hear you.
Shafiq used a freestanding shaman as versus the cap we use now.
Yes. I'm assuming he's talking about this particular region right here. They actually had to use shamadans that were, that offered no support for your head and your forehead. It's something that they had to do on their own, something that they had to balance on their own. It was an incredible feat. In fact, you have Zuba El-Klopsia, who was also another artist who balanced the shamadan the same way. She had probably one of the longest shamadans I've seen, and there's an interesting video that I would like to share with you guys at the end of this presentation, and we'll be coming right to that point that he mentioned about the shamadan. But that's a good observation. Please keep your observations coming. I'm really interested to know what you guys think. Anyway, so the next slide is about what the Ghawazee people are doing at this point in time. And at the turn of the 20th century, again, there's not a lot of work for them in urban centers. So many of them were based in the area of the Sumbat in the Delta, which is Lower Egypt. And many of them were settled in parts of Luxor and Esna and Sohaj in Upper Egypt, which is basically the south of Egypt. And all of them were just basically divided on the basis of their families and divided on the basis of ethnicity. So if you were a Nawari Ghawazee, you would be with your Nawari family of Ghawazis, which is where your Banat Mazin family comes from. And if you were blood related, you'd be, housed together. And, the interesting part is most of these Ghawazis traveled with their families, and their families were the ones who gave them musical accompaniment when they performed. So maybe the men in the family, the brothers, the fathers, the husbands were the ones who played the music for these Ghawazi entertainers everywhere they went and performed. And most of the time you'd see them at marketplaces, and very, very rarely did they appear in films. Even if they did appear in films, it was only because there was a shot of a rural countryside, and they probably just pulled in a Ghawazee group or two to make an appearance, and that's about it. There's nothing. They didn't really make an appearance in full-fledged cinema. Now, with Raqs Sharqi taking over, the demand for dancers of the entertainment hall variety was starting to go up in number, and the Awalim and the Ghawazee was slowly going out of work. And a lot of demand was now coming in for a lot of your golden era artists and the stars of the films like Samia Gamal and Tahia Carioca. And now there was a lot of demand for movies in theaters. So a lot of traditional entertainment was moving out of marketplaces and other social contexts like moolids. And now people were choosing to go to movie theaters and entertainment halls to look for entertainment instead. So this sort of made them redundant and put them in a very difficult place, because they were in a difficult place because they actually had to adopt certain practices to get back into business. And one of those practices was actually adopting the bedla, the brand of skirt. And though a lot of Ghawazee dancers and Awalim dancers would refute it, you do have a lot of historical sources pointing out to the fact that a lot of them actually adopted the bedla system to get a little more work, in the entertainment context. So that was what was happening with the Raqs Sharqi takeover. All right. And now with popular culture, like our friend mentioned I'm forgetting his name again, I'm so sorry. You mentioned something about the Shamadan in your comments. We had Zuba Kloptia, who was a notable Muhammad Ali Street alma who appeared in a number of films in the 30s and 50s. And again, she was known for her candelabra or Shamadan dances, though she was not considered an innovator because that distinction was already taken by Shafiqa Alkop much, much earlier. Then we also have Nezla Adil, who was also a Muhammad Ali Street alma who came in between the 60s to the 80s. We also have appearances we see of Nezla Adil in one or two films. So you can actually go on YouTube now and look for Nezla Adil. Earlier, there wasn't any video reference, but now you do find one or two clips. If you're lucky, if you're actually going down the rabbit hole, you do tend to find clips by Nezla Adil. And then you have people who are playing the Awalim. You have Hind Rustam, who is the Marilyn Monroe of the East, like I mentioned in my earlier slide. She played Shafiqa Kiptia in one of her films. We also have Nabawiya Mustafa, who's said to have had Alma and Awalim origins, and she's an artist from the golden era, and a lot of her hip work and body work sort of gives that away. You do tend to see those influences in her dancing, all of those slow, circular, large hip work and figures of eights. It's very interesting to watch. If you can go and check Nabawiya Mustafa's work, it'll be worth your time. And then we have the Banat Mazen sisters, who are actually the largest names that we have right now in the world of Ghawazee performers. They're actually one of the most notable names. They are actually sisters who became prominent because they danced their way to fame, and they also were one of the most heavily researched Ghawazee groups in Egypt, and received global fame and attention after dance researchers Morocco, Aisha Ali, and Edwina Nearing documented their lives and performances. You can see a lot of info on the Banat Mazen sisters today online. You'll find plenty of it. So knock yourself out. What's going on right now? When I'm talking about right now, I'm actually talking about 50 to 60 years ago and up till this point. So the social political reforms that came under Nasser's time, who was one of the rulers in the 60s, right after the 1952 revolution in Egypt, would lead to a complete decline in business on the Muhammad Ali Street, because now what he was looking at was nationalizing the film industry. There was a lot of Hollywood influence in the filmmaking earlier with the golden era, And with Nasser's time, he decides to nationalize the film industry and sort of move ahead with a more pan-national Arab socialist view on things. So what he did was he was completely against all of your local professional dancing and the sort of dancing that was being propagated in cinema, because he thought it was just disrespectful or suggestive. So what he did instead was he started to promote folkloric troupes like the Firqa Qawmiya and the Reda troupe. And a lot of importance to folkloric dances were now being given under Nasser's time, and the shift in popularity was now moving away from typical decadent entertainment into more folkloric Egyptian nationalist entertainment with Nasser's time. And we need to look at now the sort of labels that were going around in this period. So the folkloric arts were considered high art. Anybody who fell under the belly dance category or the Rakisa category, like your Awalim and Ghawazee performers, were considered dancers of low repute or low art. Under Anwar Sadat's time, who came somewhere in the 1970s after Nasser, he actually brought about an economic reform that was known as the Infita. Now, this sort of opened the economy up to the world one more time after Nasser, brought about the whole socialistic reform. Anwar Sadat was the exact opposite. He wanted to open the economy one more time. And in the process, because of the Infita, it sort of led to a period where a lot of people from outside of Egypt, from parts of the Levant and parts of Turkey and Iran and Iraq, were coming into Egypt to earn money as artists. So this was putting a lot of Egyptian artists out of work, and it was putting a lot of pressure on them economically because they were not making a lot of money. So now you were beginning to see a lot of foreign performers in Egypt, and this was actually taking a toll on performance and entertainment within Egypt at this point in time.
Shruti?
So as things go, the Awalim tradition waned into obscurity. And today you can basically, if you ever go to a proper Egyptian wedding, you'll probably see glimpses of the old style in dances at lower class weddings, but the culture as a whole is beginning to disappear. The Ghawazee tradition persists, but it faces various threats, especially from conservative parties, because again, being a Ghawazee means that you need to be public and you need to be able to give public performances. And this goes against the ideals of a lot of conservative parties and religious beliefs who are now, who sort of are regulating a lot of these performers in parts of in Kina and Luxor and in places like Aswan. But if you do ever take a trip to Egypt, and this is something I plan to do again the next year, you can still take a class with one of the Banat Mazin sisters. She's not very active in the performance scene, but she still does teach a lot of foreigners, and she still performs at certain mulids. But maybe it's because of her age and because of other things that are going on sociopolitically in Luxor. You don't see a lot of Khadija Mazin. If you do, please do take a class from her if you're ever in Egypt. She is one of the last original Ghawazee performers who's still alive and who's still very much happy to help people who want to take a class or two with her or just spend time with her.
Shruti?
Yeah.
Tariq Sultan has to say that the Banat Mazin were the most skilled. I was lucky to see Khairia and her sister Raja. They were spectacular in their costumes. The stage troops weren't doing real folklore, but tactical dance based on folkloric themes.
Absolutely. 100%. Wow. Okay.
Also, to add to that, Nazla Adil was the last of the old school. She was dancing up into 70s and 80s.
That's right. That's absolutely correct. So when you're looking at the Banat Mazin, you're not exactly looking at traditional, any sort of traditional folklore or dance. It's basically something that they came, it's of Nawari origins, obviously, because it's where they are from. They're of the Nawari ethnicity. And a lot of their dancing is actually very different. Even their costuming is very different from what you would see in terms of a normal Ghawazee in the early 20th century or mid 20th century. But their costuming was actually very, very different. They were shorter skirts, they were layered skirts. It had more of a playful vibe to it. And I think if you want to look at it from the perspective of the audience back then, they were very risky in terms of their movements, their movement quality, what they were performing, and the quality of their work. It was actually very risky. So very, very different from your traditional folkloric context. But yeah, the observation is pretty spot on. Pretty spot on. Thank you so much. All of you are just giving such amazing input to this entire thing, and I'm just really happy that some of you are actually aware of these things. So it's amazing to see how much we can learn from one another, and just keep it coming. I really would love to know what you think. All right, so this is basically the end of the presentation, and that's me. So I am sitting in the Georg Anderson Museum in one of the reconstructed sections of the museum. So this is supposedly a mushrabia, and where I'm sitting is basically where an Awalim performer would have sat, and she would have performed if she had to perform for a mixed gender group. So if there were men involved, she wouldn't reveal herself, but she'd perform from behind these lattice windows, and basically people would just be able to hear the Awalim sing or recite poetry. So it's actually very, very interesting, because from this point, the Awalim can actually see what's happening, but the people can't see back. That view is completely blocked. So that sort of engineering is something that we see even in our palaces in Rajasthan. It's very, very interesting to see this crossover in culture and, how things played out architecturally as well. So this was shot by Sara Saida during my Journey Through Egypt course in Egypt the last year, and that's one of the Awalim quarters and a reconstruction of it. This is actually a Muhammad Ali Street cafe, and one of the oldest on Muhammad Ali Street. This is where a lot of Osta would be sitting with her clientele and basically negotiating the price in terms of, a performance, or where they need to perform, how much they're going to charge. So all of these important meetings happened in places like this. Or if there were budding artists that wanted to get some work on Muhammad Ali Street, this is where they would come and wait it out and talk to people of repute, or talk to people who had connections. So this particular cafe is said to be over, I think, 60 or 70, no, not 70 or 80 years old. This is a typical Awalim quarter, one of the quarters that I thought was actually picturesque enough to shoot or photograph. This is actually in a very dilapidated state. Most of Muhammad Ali Street is in a very dilapidated state. And today you see a lot of furniture shops. You do see a lot of instrument makers and food shops and all of those things, but mostly furniture shops and a lot of vegetable bazaars. This gentleman right here is Mr. Syed Henkesh. Now, for a lot of people who know Mr. Syed Henkesh, he is a legend in Egypt. His family is legendary. They have an indelible legacy in terms of music, and they run a very old and actually one of the most oldest stores on the Muhammad Ali Street for instrumentation. And Mr. Syed Henkesh was actually kind enough to talk to us the last year. He shared his experiences with us, and he was really sweet. So if you ever do go to Muhammad Ali Street yourself, please do make a stop at the Henkesh Instruments store. And this is the Muhammad Ali Street today. Just a road with buildings, I suppose. But this is how it was even back in the day, but with probably a lot more music makers, a lot more dancers, a lot more life. But today it's just another road that connects the citadel to the main market in Egypt. I will be posting links to some additional resources, but these are some of the resources that you could look at widely. If you're looking for Ghawazee music, you might want to take a look at Aisha Ali's work. She's done a lot of commendable work in the field of Ghawazee study and Ghawazee music. So maybe you could purchase the music right off her page or on Amazon. And then you do have an interesting article on Ghawazee rhythms and will patterns by Edwina Nearing on Gilded Serpent. Maybe you can take a look at that too. Some of the books that I have religiously gone through and finished reading Before They Were Belly Dancers by Kathleen Fraser. You Asked Aunt Rocky Answers and Advice about Raqs Sharqi and Raqs Shabi. This is by Morocco. Was also a very, very famous artist and who's done a lot of research in her time. Egyptian Belly Dance and Transition by Heather D. Ward, who's also somebody I look up to a great deal and who's been kind enough to share her knowledge with all of us. A Trade Like Any Other, Female Singers and Dancers in Egypt, and An Account of the Manners and Customs of Modern Egyptians by Edward Lane. So these are some of the things you can always come back to when this recording is available in case you didn't get it down right away. All right, thank you. That was my presentation, and I'm going to exit. All right, so does anybody have any questions at all? If you do have questions, I know we've slightly overshot by 5 minutes, but even if we do, please put it down in the comments box, and I will come back and respond as soon as I can, and as much as I can. Over to you, Lina.
Yeah, right. Sorry. Yeah, thank you so much, Shruti, for that. It was very, very informative. I would actually bite into it myself. I caught some parts of it, but very, very cool. In fact, you did have people commenting and actually getting very engaged, which is very good. And thank you for your gifts. So Shruti's happy to have you as a part of engaging with her more and also actually digging into her material. So she's been very sweet to offer that. She's going to tell you more once you visit the Facebook group. And Shruti, you want to say something on that?
Yeah, so I'm going to post like a small question based on the presentation. Of course, you guys will always have the option to go back to this and redo this entire thing with me. I will post a small question based on what we've spoken about today. And I think my top 3 answers will get a chance to be a part of my lecture series that's going to happen in August. And it's called Beyond Belly Dance. And this is the 4th edition of the lecture series. And this time we're going to have 3 amazing international artists who are going to come and basically lecture us on subjects of their interest, and I will be taking 2 subjects myself. So you basically get an all pass to Beyond Belly Dance for August.
Right, that's awesome. Thank you. Count me in as well. Yeah.
Yay.
That would be amazing to also actually also go deep into that kind of material for myself. So thank you so much. And yeah, so you can find Shruti on her Instagram, on her Facebook. I know she said, I'm not very tech savvy, but you can totally in these places. And she constantly hosts talks beyond Belly Dance online, and she also has other classes, so there's a lot of stuff that she offers. So follow her and you'll get a lot of information. And yeah, thank you, Shruti, for all that amazing insightful information which you've gathered over years and lots of hard work and labor over it. So yeah, thank you so much, really appreciate. And yeah, send us a heart, a comment, a word or 2, and tell us how you like this workshop. And also don't forget to give back to the teachers who are actually donating their time and be able to give back to the community. So all the teachers are stepping up and donating their time, and I think it would be great to complete the circle and also give back in some way to the campaign and share the campaign. You just have to hit the share button and you could totally share it on social media. In fact, some of our teachers have done that, and they've successfully got a lot of donations just by sharing the campaign. So, that's very encouraging, and y'all could totally do that as well. So anyways, tomorrow we have two amazing workshops. Okay, one is by me and there's another one by Madhura called Foods for Fitness. So go catch that, and yeah, I'll see you tomorrow, right?
Thank you, Lena. Thank you for everything.
Yeah, right. Okay, cool. Ciao. Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Hey, everybody, depending on which part of the world you are in. Shruti and I are from India, so it's like, we're going to go to
Good
bed
night.
now. All right, take care. Ciao, everybody.